So in this lecture, we're just going to be looking at the decision to turn out to vote, not who you're going to vote for, just whether or not you're going to vote at all. And we're going to work through a series of models that might explain people's turnout decisions. Um, None of these models are necessarily the true model, the true way in which social influence takes place on turnout decisions, but there are different possibilities, and there's evidence, some evidence for all of them, right? But let me begin with something that is generally true and generally believed. The standard theory, the standard finding is that people who are better educated are more likely to turn out. That has been true for as long as we've had survey data, and it's overwhelmingly true. People with advanced degrees are more likely to vote than people with college degrees. More people with college degrees are more likely to vote than people who have um, attended some college but didn't graduate, or got an associate's degree but didn't get a bachelor's, and those people are more likely to vote than people who only have a high school diploma, and those people are more likely to vote than people who don't have a high school diploma. And the standard theory is essentially that people who are more educated are more interested in politics. People who are more educated have an easier time understanding what's happening in the news. People who are more education have more money, higher income, so they have more free time to be able to devote to politics, have an easier time turning out on election day because they can either pay for babysitters or take a day off from work, or have an easier time taking either the full day or part of the day off from work. Therefore, people who are educated are more likely to vote for all these individual reasons, right? But people who are more educated may be more likely to vote because of network effects, okay? And so when working through these different models, we'll come back to why might this explain why the educated are more likely to vote. And the first model we're going to go through is what would be termed a simple contagion model. And so let's imagine that we have 5 individuals who are interconnected in this way that I have it. The blue lines are edges or ties between the potential voters, and those nodes are of 5 potential voters. And if we found that one of them decided to vote, and that's indicated here by their frame turning green, well then one of the people who they're connected to might turn out to vote. Okay, actually, both of the people they're connected to might turn out to vote, but it's probabilistic. So we see one person decide to vote, but the other woman didn't, and because that person voted, the person that they're tied to is more likely to vote. But on the other hand, the friend of the initial voter didn't vote, so that person's friend doesn't vote. Okay, so we see here a simple contagion model just means that if my friend decides to do something, I am more likely to do that, whether that be smoking, or if my friend doesn't decide to, if my friend gets sick, I'm more likely to get sick, or in this case, if my friend votes, I'm more likely to vote. I won't necessarily smoke or get sick or vote, but it's just more likely. So in this simple contagion model, why are people with more education more likely to vote? People who are educated have more friends who are educated. People who are educated are more likely to turn out for all those reasons we given before. Therefore, if I'm educated, and none of those things necessarily apply to me, I don't find politics that interesting, maybe I don't have enough money to actually take time off of work, but my friends do, so my friends are voting, that makes it more likely that I'll vote. That contagion is more likely because I'm surrounded by these people who are more likely to vote. So that's a simple model. A more complex model is something we might call a threshold model. Okay, and so in this threshold model, what we have here is we have 12 individuals, and they have a number sign next to them. The number sign is going to be their threshold, which we'll explain in a second. And for our purposes, they're all tied together, so they all know one another. So the edges, displaying the lines doesn't help anything. So let's just get rid of that and just stick with the 12 individuals and their thresholds. What the threshold here is the idea that you will do something if that number of your friends are doing it, right? So if we start in the top row, 3, 3, 2, it's going to take the top 2 individuals. They need to see 3 other people vote before they'll vote, and that other person needs to see 2 other people vote or voting before they'll decide to vote. Okay, but in the middle we have somebody whose threshold is 0, so she doesn't need to see anybody else vote before she decides to vote. So she decides to vote. That means one person's voting in this group of 12. Well, then anyone who has a threshold of 1 will vote. Now there are 2 people voting, so anyone with a threshold of 2 is going to vote. Well, now we have 4 people voting, so that means anyone who has a threshold of 3 or 4 will also vote. Now we have 9 people voting, so anyone who's a threshold up to 9 is going to vote. And so now we have 11 people voting, but our 12th person has a threshold of 15, so they need to see more people voting before they'll vote, right? So this is this idea, right, that it's not as simple as just, oh, I see a person next to me doing something, so I'll be more likely to do it. It's that I'm essentially judging, well, how common is this thing that people are doing, and if everybody's doing it, maybe I'll do it. But for some people, they don't need to see that many others doing something before they'll decide to do it, right? Now, the tricky bit with this threshold model is it depends on the distribution of thresholds. So let's imagine a different distribution of thresholds. Everybody's threshold here is 1. And in this case, nobody votes because they all look to see is one other person voting. And no, nobody else is voting. So in each case, they decide not to vote. So even though here the average threshold is lower, because there's nobody with a threshold of 0, we actually don't get the contagion effect. So why are people with more education more likely to vote according to this model of social influence? Well, people who are educated have more friends who are educated. People who are educated are more interested in politics, which means that there are more people who are likely to have a threshold of 0, right? So if educated people have more friends, and many of whom have a threshold of 0, that means contagion is more likely. Okay, that if my threshold is 1 or 2 or 3, I am likely to have 1 or 2 or 3 friends if I'm educated who have a threshold of 0, so I'm more likely to see 1, 2, or 3 people vote, which means I'm more likely to vote, and so on and so forth. But if we have people who are not educated, you're less likely to have someone who has a threshold of 0, less likely to kick that contagion off. That sort of spread of influence is less likely to take off. The next model is the social proximity model. And in this case, we have our network. This time, 2 people are taken out. We have a network of 10 individuals, and they're not fully connected. They're connected based on the lines I've drawn here. And in this case, we have numbers, but the numbers are paths, not thresholds, right? And a path is essentially the distance it takes to get from one person to another. In this case, our one person that we're going to start with, it's the path from that target individual there. Well, she's got a path of 0 because it is her. She is that node. All the ones who are 1 are directly connected to her. Those are her direct friends. The people with 2 are the friends of friends, and the people with a path of 3 are the friends of friends of friends. Okay, so let's imagine she decides to run for office, and because she decides to run for office, she is going to turn out and vote for herself. Well, that probably means her friends are going to vote. Okay, now that her friends are voting, her friends of friends are more likely to vote, though not necessarily all of the friends of friends will vote, which means then as we get to the next path down the line, not all of her friends of friends of friends are going to vote. And if we add in another individual who's 4 steps away, that person probably won't vote. Essentially, if you are very closely connected to a candidate, you're more likely to turn out because of that candidate, right? And as you get further and further away, either the turnout decisions, the turnout cascade stops, or the strength, the idea that I'm going to vote gets weaker each time, and so eventually that stops too, right? So in this case, people who are educated have more friends who are educated. People who are educated are more likely to seek elective office, more likely to decide to become candidates. Therefore, people who are educated are more likely to have friends or friends of friends who seek elective office. And so for that reason, if I'm closer to the person who's running, I'm more likely to actually run myself. This model makes a lot of sense for low salience elections. It's unlikely, no matter how educated you are, you know anyone personally or through one connection who's running for president, but you might know somebody personally or through 1 or 2 connections if you're educated who's running for local school board or county executive or something like that. The last model is what I'm going to call the biased information model, right? And here it relies on this idea that the more educated are more likely to receive and send biased signals because the more educated are better able to counter-argue information that is harmful to their party or is helpful to the other party, right? So if I'm an educated Democrat and I see information that says something good about Republicans, I know more to say, well, that might be true, but it's probably not, or that might be true, but not in all situations, or just I don't think that's true because of this other information I have. Okay, and if I hear something that's negative about the Democratic Party, I can dismiss that as well. So the information that educated people take in tends to be more pro their side, and then generally then the information they're sending out to other people tends to be more pro their side. So let's imagine we have two ego networks. The person in each case with the question mark, that's our target individual, right? And the target individual is trying to decide whether or not they're going to vote. And in the top sort of network, the person has two Republican friends, and those Republican friends are educated, perhaps, and they send sort of biased information that's just pro-Republican, and so that other person says, well, okay, I'm going to vote, and I'm going to vote because everything I've heard says that the Republicans are the best and or better than the Democrats, so I'm going to vote. It's an easy decision. The person on the bottom hears from one Democrat and one Republican. So he has a harder time making up his mind, and so he says, you know, I hear some good things about the Democrats, but I hear some bad things about them too. There's some good things about the Republicans, but I hear some bad things about the Republicans too. So I don't know who to vote for. And since I don't know who to vote for, I'm not going to turn out to vote. So that's one way this could work, but let's consider something else, right? Let's imagine that we have the same network at the top, but at the bottom, the ego network. In this case, they're not Democrats or Republicans. They're undecided. They do pay attention. They do know stuff about politics, but they're undecided, and so they send messages that are sort of mixed. They say, oh, you know what, I've heard some good things about the Republicans, but I've heard some good things about the Democrats. So we end up in the exact same situation. The person with the biased signalers on top send signals that are pro-Republican, so that person turns out to vote because they think, oh, it's an easy decision, the Republicans are the best. But the person on the bottom doesn't turn out to vote because they don't know who they're supposed to vote for. The people have sort of who they're getting information from is send them very mixed signals. So in this situation, why do people with more education, why are they more likely to vote? The people have educated friends who are more educated. Educated people are more likely to send biased signals about the parties. People who are educated, therefore, have these educated friends who are more likely to send biased signals, and therefore the people who are educated and are in homogeneous networks are more likely to turn out. If they're educated and they're in heterogeneous networks, well, then it's probably not going to work that way. But if you're an educated person with educated friends, and you don't follow politics that closely, but your friends do, but they're all members of the same party, then you're going to turn out to vote because you only hear good things about that party, so you think the vote decision is really easy. Okay, so there's evidence for all these different types of models of social influence on turnout. Some of the evidence, like with the as I said, with the social proximity to the candidate model, the evidence there is better in sort of local elections. People have looked at, for example, on a college campus, when a student decides they're going to run for office in the local community, all of a sudden that campus, the students on that campus are more likely to turn out because of connections directly to that student who decided to run for office. But generally, what we find, whether it's through social media or through this sort of just normal interpersonal influence, that you can get these contagion effects, the spread of voting. And when one person decides that they're going to vote, their friends are more likely to vote, and their friends of friends are more likely to vote. That's one reason that candidates oftentimes will go to college campuses and try and convince people on those campuses to vote with the hope that that can start a domino effect of more and more people on that campus voting. If you can flip one person among college students, and college students do not have the best turnout record, but if we can flip one person who wasn't voting and make them vote, that perhaps that's getting them just not that one vote, but 2 or 3 extra votes as their friends start to vote, and then maybe that can spiral and continue to build up larger and larger and larger numbers of turnout among those students.